In the grand, brutal theater of medieval Europe, kingdoms were chessboards and royalty were the pieces. We imagine grand castles, noble knights, and chivalrous kings. But beneath the shimmering tapestry of myth, there lies a darker, more unsettling reality. What the history books often fail to convey, what gets lost between the dates of battles and the lineage of kings, is the chilling truth that the most valuable pieces on this board were often the most vulnerable. They were the daughters of kings, their innocence a currency, their futures a bargaining chip. Their very existence was a political tool, their hands to be given not in love, but in strategy. In the next 40 minutes, you're going to discover the horrifying truth about one of these princesses. Her story is not one of romance or adventure. It is a story that pushes the boundaries of what we can even imagine, a tale so bleak and so cruel it feels more like a dark fable than a chapter of history. But what I'm about to reveal is all too real, meticulously documented in the cold, hard records of the past. We are about to uncover a life that was stolen before it had truly begun. This is not a fairy tale. There is no happily ever after. In 1396, a 6-year-old French princess was forced to marry the 29-year-old King of England. She was not a willing participant. She was a pawn in a desperate political game, a child sacrificed on the altar of diplomacy to end a war that had bled 2 nations dry for generations. This is the tragic story of Isabella of Valois. Hers is a life that reveals the terrifying truth of medieval power, a world where a wedding veil could be a shroud, and a crown was not a symbol of glory, but a cage. So before we descend into this harrowing chronicle, make sure you are subscribed and have clicked the notification bell. You will want to follow every step of this journey as we dig deep into the underbelly of history. To even begin to comprehend how a 6-year-old girl could end up married to a man 5 times her age, a man old enough to be her father, we first need to expose the violent, unstable world she was born into. The late 14th century was not a time of honor and valor. It was a time of profound and unrelenting violence. For decades upon decades, England and France had been locked in the savage embrace of the 100 Years' War. This was not a single, continuous conflict, but a relentless series of brutal, bloody campaigns, punctuated only by fragile truces that were inevitably shattered by renewed bloodshed. Generations knew nothing but war, the land was ravaged, and the treasuries of both kingdoms were hemorrhaging gold to fuel the endless cycle of destruction. Across the Channel, France was ruled by King Charles VI. He was a man haunted by demons, both political and terrifyingly personal. While his daughter, Princess Isabella, was still just a girl, her father, the king, began to suffer from horrifying psychotic episodes. Imagine the terror within the court as the king would erupt into madness, moments where he failed to recognize his own wife and children, seeing them as strangers or enemies. But here's what makes this even more disturbing, what pushes it into the realm of pure nightmare. He later developed the bizarre and terrifying glass delusion. This was a deep, unshakable conviction that his body was made of glass. He believed that if anyone touched him, he would instantly shatter into 1,000 pieces. With a king lost to such a profound madness, France was fractured, a rudderless ship controlled by the king's powerful and perpetually feuding uncles, who cared more for their own power than the stability of the realm. In England, the situation was hardly better. The throne was occupied by King Richard II. His own story was one of trauma. He had become king at the tender age of 10, his childhood stolen from him, twisted and warped by the immense pressures of the crown. Unlike his famous, warlike father, the Black Prince, Richard was not a man who reveled in combat. He craved peace, a desire that put him directly at odds with his own nobles, who had grown rich and powerful from the war with France. For them, peace was not a blessing. It was a threat to their status and their income. Richard was also a man drowning in a sea of personal grief. His first wife, the beloved Anne of Bohemia, had been stolen from him by the plague in 1394, and her death left him utterly devastated. Their marriage, by all accounts a genuinely loving one, had been politically crucial but had produced no children. This left the succession of the English throne dangerously uncertain. Now a 29-year-old widower, Richard was under immense pressure. He needed a new wife, not just to secure an heir, but to forge a powerful alliance that could finally bring about the peace he so desperately desired. It was in this crucible of continental war, royal madness, and political strife that the idea for a shocking, almost unthinkable union was born. The solution they devised would be a peace treaty sealed not with a signature on parchment, but with the marriage of a child. The fate of two warring kingdoms would be placed upon the tiny, fragile shoulders of Princess Isabella of Valois. The complex and delicate negotiations began in earnest in 1396. For England's King Richard II, this marriage was nothing short of a political masterstroke. A union with the French king's own daughter would bring with it a 28-year truce, a generation of peace. This would allow England's ravaged treasury to finally recover from decades of war. More importantly for Richard, it would sever the financial lifeline of the war-hungry nobles who constantly challenged his authority, crushing their power and securing his own. But there was a more personal, more unsettling calculation at play. By choosing a bride so young, a mere child, Richard could ensure that she would be raised entirely within the English court. She would be molded from childhood into a perfectly English queen, loyal only to him, with no memory or allegiance to the French court she left behind. Think about that for a moment. This was a long-term strategy of indoctrination. Consummation of the marriage was, of course, forbidden by church law until she reached the age of 12, but Richard, still a young man himself at 29, believed he could wait. He was playing the long game. The French court, led by Isabella's powerful uncles, saw the match as a staggering victory. The long truce would give their fractured, badly led country the breathing room it desperately needed to stabilize. Of course, there was also the matter of the dowry, an astronomical sum of 800,000 gold francs. This wasn't just money. It was a fortune that symbolized the immense weight and importance of this new alliance. The terms of the marriage contract were cold, meticulous, and utterly devoid of sentiment. They read like a business transaction. If Isabella were to die before the age of 12, Richard would be required to marry one of her female relatives, and he would only get to keep half of the dowry. If the marriage was never consummated and the alliance broke down, the entire dowry, along with all of her magnificent jewels, were to be returned to France. She was, in every sense, a commodity. When the English envoys traveled to France to meet the proposed bride, they found a small, pretty girl who had been carefully coached. She dutifully recited the lines she had been taught, saying she was happy to become the Queen of England because she was told it would make her a great and important lady. In her mind, this was a game. She practiced her role as a queen while playing with her dolls, the line between solemn royal duty and a child's game completely and tragically blurred. The manifest of her trousseau, the collection of possessions she would bring to England, tells the whole story. It contained not just breathtaking gowns and priceless jewels, but the dolls and simple toys from her nursery. The proxy marriage, where an English noble stood in for the king, took place in Paris on March 9, 1396, officially sealing the truce. But back in England, the reaction was not celebration, but deep suspicion. The peace felt like a betrayal to powerful and ambitious nobles like Richard's own uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, a man who had built his entire fortune and reputation on the war with France. The marriage to a child also meant there would be no heir for years, leaving the kingdom in a state of prolonged uncertainty and vulnerability. The wedding was meant to secure Richard's throne, but the deep and bitter divisions it created would ultimately tear it apart. In October of 1396, Isabella of Valois left her home for the last time. The 6-year-old princess, accompanied by her father, the Mad King of France, and a vast, glittering retinue, traveled to the border of the English-held territory of Calais. Here, in a field prepared for a grand display of political theater, the formal handover of the child bride would take place. The meeting of the two kings was a carefully orchestrated spectacle of magnificence and power. They greeted each other with a formal kiss of peace and exchanged lavish, symbolic gifts. Then, the moment arrived. Princess Isabella, a tiny figure in a breathtaking gown of blue velvet embroidered with golden fleurs-de-lis and wearing a diadem of gold and pearls, was brought before the English king. Contemporary accounts say she was tearful and visibly overwhelmed, so small and frightened that she had to be carried by her uncles. Her father presented her to Richard. The 29-year-old king then bent down and kissed the child who was to be his wife. Immediately after this chilling ceremony, she was taken away by English ladies-in-waiting, her French life, her family, her home, officially and irrevocably over. 4 days later, in the Church of St. Nicholas in Calais, the official wedding took place. Isabella, now just shy of her 7th birthday, stood before the altar and repeated vows she could not possibly have understood. With those words, she ceased to be a French princess and became Isabella, Queen of England. From Calais, she was moved to Windsor Castle, a vast, imposing fortress that would be both her home and her gilded cage. She was surrounded by unimaginable luxury, waited on by a host of attendants, and dressed in the finest clothes. But she was utterly isolated, a foreigner in a land whose language she did not speak, separated from everyone and everything she had ever known. Richard, for his part, treated her with a conspicuous kindness. Their relationship was not that of a husband and wife, but more like that of a doting uncle and his young ward. He visited her regularly at her separate residence, and court chroniclers noted that Isabella and her ladies eagerly looked forward to his visits, finding the king to be funny and kind. He showered her with gifts and is said to have promised to be a father to her as well as a husband. But here is the question that the history books don't dare to ask. Is this true kindness, a man trying to make the best of a terrible situation? Or is this grooming, a calculated effort to win the absolute devotion of a child who would one day be his wife in truth? The ambiguity is deeply disturbing. In January of 1397, at the age of 7, Isabella was escorted to the hallowed halls of Westminster Abbey for her coronation. Dressed in royal robes, she became the youngest queen consort in the history of England. The event was a massive public spectacle. The crowds in London were so enormous, so desperate to get a look at the child queen, that people were crushed to death on London Bridge in the stampede. For the people, she was a fragile, living symbol of a peace they desperately craved. But for Isabella, she was a lonely little girl playing the part of a queen, her entire childhood sacrificed for a treaty that was already beginning to fray at the edges. While Isabella lived her strange, sequestered life inside the walls of Windsor, the political climate in England was growing toxic. Freed from the immediate pressures of war, Richard's rule became more erratic, more autocratic. In 1397, convinced of plots against him, he moved decisively against his enemies. He ordered the arrest of the powerful Earls of Arundel and Warwick, and his own uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, the very men who had most fiercely opposed his peace policy with France. The purge was swift and ruthless. Arundel was publicly executed, Gloucester was secretly murdered in his prison cell, and Warwick was exiled. This tyrannical act sent a shockwave of fear and hatred through the English aristocracy. Wait, it gets worse. Richard's actions grew ever more despotic. He began to govern without consulting Parliament, levying crushing and arbitrary taxes, and systematically alienating the very people whose support he needed to survive. He was ruling not as a king, but as a tyrant. The breaking point, the fatal error, came in 1399. Richard's powerful uncle, John of Gaunt, died. His vast inheritance, the Duchy of Lancaster, was meant to pass to his son, Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's own cousin, whom Richard had previously exiled on flimsy charges. In what can only be described as a fatal act of greed and political suicide, Richard seized the vast Lancastrian estates for the crown, intending to use the wealth to fund a military campaign in Ireland. This was a direct attack on the entire principle of hereditary ownership, the very foundation of the aristocratic world. If the king could disinherit the most powerful duke in the land, then no nobleman's property or title was safe. Richard had just given his ambitious, exiled cousin the perfect pretext to return to England, not just as a wronged heir, but as a savior of the realm. While Richard was away fighting in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke landed on the English coast. He claimed that he had only come to reclaim his rightful inheritance, but he found a country that was ripe for open rebellion. Disaffected nobles, terrified of Richard's tyranny, flocked to his banner. Support for Henry swelled into an unstoppable tide. By the time Richard returned from Ireland, it was far too late. His support had completely evaporated. His own army deserted him. Utterly alone and abandoned, Richard surrendered to his cousin at Flint Castle in Wales. He was taken as a prisoner to London, the very city that had, only a few years earlier, crushed its own citizens in a desperate scramble to celebrate his child bride. For the 10-year-old Queen Isabella, The world had been turned completely upside down. Richard, deeply concerned for her safety, had moved her to the secure stronghold of Portchester Castle before he left for Ireland. He visited her there one last time, a gentle and sad farewell with a promise to see her again soon hanging between them. It was the last time they would ever see each other. Now, with Richard deposed, she was a well-cared-for but captive queen, held under house arrest by the new regime. On September 29, 1399, in the formidable Tower of London, Richard II was formally deposed. On October 13th, Henry Bolingbroke was crowned King Henry IV. The fragile peace Richard had sacrificed to childhood for was shattered, and the child queen was now the widow of a deposed and imprisoned king, a valuable pawn in a new and far more dangerous game. At the tender age of 10, Isabella of Valois was a widow. In February of 1400, an official announcement was made from the new court. The deposed King Richard II was dead at Pontefract Castle. The official story, the one broadcast for public consumption, was that he had starved himself to death out of grief and despair. But the truth that history whispers, the rumor that spread like wildfire through the courts of Europe, is that he was deliberately and cruelly starved to death on the direct orders of the new king, Henry IV, to eliminate any possibility of a rival claimant to the throne. Isabella was now in an extraordinarily precarious position. She was the daughter of the King of France, the widow of the man Henry had usurped, and a child alone in a hostile country. The French court, enraged by Richard's overthrow and death, immediately demanded her return, along with the full repayment of her enormous dowry and all of her personal jewels. But the new king, Henry IV, had other plans. He saw Isabella not as a tragic figure, but as a political asset. In a move of stunning cynicism, he proposed to marry the 10-year-old widow to his own son and heir, the future King Henry V, who was then a young teenager. Such a marriage would legitimize the new Lancastrian dynasty by linking it directly to the old regime through Richard's queen. But what nobody tells you, what stands out as a moment of incredible defiance, is what happened next. Isabella, despite her extreme youth and terrifying circumstances, showed a remarkable and unshakable resolve. She flatly refused the proposal. She entered into a state of public, formal mourning for her late husband, Richard, and refused to even consider marrying the son of the man she held directly responsible for his death. Think about that for a moment. A 10-year-old girl, a prisoner, defying a usurper king out of a fierce sense of loyalty to the man who had been her husband. Her refusal created a difficult diplomatic stalemate. The French government continued to press for her immediate return, but Henry IV, whose own treasury was unstable, did not have the money to repay the massive dowry, a non-negotiable condition for her return, since the marriage to Richard was never consummated. For 2 long, agonizing years, Isabella remained in England, a diplomatic hostage. She was moved from castle to castle, kept under constant guard, her fate debated by men in power while she waited in limbo. Finally, a treaty was signed in May of 1401. Henry, seeing no way to bend the girl to his will, agreed to return Isabella to France. However, in a final act of defiance, he refused to repay the dowry that had already been paid, a point of bitter contention that would fuel the conflict between England and France for years to come. On July 21, 1401, Isabella of Valois was formally handed over to the French authorities at Calais, the very same port where she had arrived as a nervous child bride nearly 5 years earlier. She returned to her homeland a widow at 11 years old, her strange and tragic reign as Queen of England over. She had been a pawn in one political game, only to be thrust immediately into another. Upon her return to France, Isabella re-entered a court that was at once familiar and profoundly different. She was no longer just a princess. She was a former queen, a widow, a figure of immense political significance who had witnessed firsthand the brutal overthrow of a king. She carried with her the ghosts of a fallen court and a dead husband. Her value as a marriage pawn, however, had not diminished in the slightest. In 1406, at the age of 16, she was married once again, this time to her own 11-year-old cousin, Charles, the Duke of Orleans. It was yet another cold, political match, designed to consolidate power within the fractured French royal family. By all accounts, she was deeply unhappy. It is said that she cried uncontrollably throughout the entire wedding ceremony. Her new husband, Charles of Orleans, would grow up to become one of the most celebrated and gifted poets of the Middle Ages. But their time together was destined to be brutally short. Just a year after their marriage, Charles's father was assassinated in the streets of Paris, an act which plunged France headlong into a vicious and bloody civil war between the houses of Orleans and Burgundy. Isabella, now the Duchess of Orleans, was once again at the very center of a violent political firestorm. For 3 years, she lived as Charles's wife, navigating the treacherous currents of civil war. But her life, which had begun with such high-stakes international drama, was destined to end in a quiet, domestic tragedy. On September 13, 1409, Isabella of Valois died. She was just 19 years old. The cause was tragically common in an age without modern medicine. She died in childbirth, succumbing to complications after delivering her only daughter, a little girl named Joan. The baby survived, but the young woman who had been a queen, a widow, and a duchess all before her 20th birthday did not. She was buried, but even in death, she found no peace. Decades later, her remains were moved, only to have her tomb desecrated and destroyed during the chaotic upheaval of the French Revolution. It was a final, ignominious chapter in a life that was defined from beginning to end by turmoil. Isabella of Valois' story is a profound and devastating human tragedy. It's a life story that can be summarized in a heartbreakingly brief sentence. Queen at 7, widow at 10, dead at 19. Her entire existence was dictated by the needs and ambitions of powerful men. Her unstable father, her calculating uncles, her kind but politically motivated first husband, and her usurping enemy. She was a piece to be moved on a board, a symbol of a peace that never lasted, a political hostage whose freedom was a bargaining chip. Her defiant refusal of Henry IV marriage proposal, her steadfast loyalty to the memory of Richard, offers a brief, tantalizing glimpse of a strong will that was forged in the fires of loss and betrayal. But ultimately, her legacy is one of sacrifice. Her childhood was sacrificed for a truce that barely lasted 3 years before collapsing back into war. Her enormous dowry, meant to secure peace, instead became a source of further conflict that lasted for decades. And that is the grim truth that lies behind the castles and the crowns. The great, grinding cycle of conflict she was meant to end simply continued, consuming those she was connected to in its relentless churn. In a bitter twist of fate, her own younger sister, Catherine of Valois, would eventually be married to the very man Isabella refused, King Henry V of England. And her second husband, the poet Charles of Orleans, would be captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt and would spend the next 25 years of his life as a prisoner in England. That's what cycles do when no one has the power to stop them. The story of Isabella of Valois is a stark and necessary reminder that behind the grand tapestries of history, behind the dates and the battles, are real human lives. Hers was a life robbed of choice, robbed of freedom, and ultimately, robbed of time. Isabella of Valois. Remember her name, remember her story, and remember that history is not just about dates and battles, but about the people who paid the price for the ambitions of kings. If you were moved by this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Isabella's story do you find the most tragic or the most infuriating? Your perspective is a vital part of keeping these stories alive. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the underbelly of history.